In this little presentation, we're going to take a slightly different, I suppose, approach to anatomical Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, where I don't have my skeleton with me. You don't see my face, but you hear my beautiful, beautiful voice. And we're going to cover, I suppose, the real introduction to how we can practice our flexibility for grappling sports. And before we get started, let's look at a couple of learning objectives, but also let's quickly familiarize ourselves with a few common terms. So, first and foremost, for the next, I suppose, half an hour, what you will primarily be learning is understanding what flexibility is and what it actually isn't. You know, a lot of people out there think that joint mobility is active, stretching or active flexibility, or, flexibility plus strength. There's a lot of misinformation. So we're going to really debunk what flexibility is and, first and foremost, what it's not. And then you will be able to understand the 4 types of flexibility alongside the benefits of having sufficient flexibility. And then the most hated term, at least on my end in the fitness world, is the term functional. And we're going to look at what that, as you can see in bold text, what that actually means. Now, what we got to understand first is that flexibility itself is having the ability, in layman's terms, to put your limbs in the positions where they need to be for whatever it is that you want to do. So let's say that you are 80 years old and all you want to do is to have enough flexibility to reach overhead for a cup in the cupboard. Then, that's going to be a very different level of flexibility compared to someone who is, I don't know, a taekwondo athlete who needs to score points, kicking someone in the head, or a Muay Thai fighter whose game is, greatly based around the ability to kick people hard in the ribs, compared to someone who is doing grappling sports and they have the ability to twist people into weird positions, from the bottom position, which is normally quite unheard of. So you can see there that flexibility itself is actually the motor control, the motor ability for you to be able to position your limb wherever you need it to be with control so that you can do the tasks that you want to do. And that's really, really important, because we then need to understand that if someone doesn't have the required amounts of flexibility for the work that they want to do, we need to do stretching. And I suppose that's really only one way of doing it is, the classical static stretching. But then you also have other types of flexibility that we're going to see very soon. And we need to understand that the process of including stretching, even weightlifting into our training programs, that's going to be, I suppose, almost a process in which you improve your ability to move your limbs into these certain positions. Cool. And you can already tell now that if you have functional in front of something, you can see that we are looking at improving a specific function for a specific task for a specific individual. And this sounds really fucking boring, and I'm going to spice it up by taking a slurp of coffee. But it is very, very, very important. So let's kick off. And as you can already tell, I'm not going to just give you, oh, here are some stretches that you can find on fucking Instagram, because you can do that yourself. But what I really want for you to be able to get out of this quick little lecture, video, presentation, whatever term you would like to use, is to show you the thinking process behind flexibility. And I have put a toolbox here because I want to help you build a toolbox so that you can critically think about what's going to work the best for you. So if you are someone listening to this who maybe you have incredible hip mobility and hip flexibility to be exact, and shoulder flexibility, but you keep on getting injured, maybe you need less flexibility. If you are someone who have great flexibility, let's say you could do your side splits, but you still struggle, being able to do a specific movement in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, maybe you have to develop more specific flexibility for that position, or maybe you need to develop strength in the flexibility levels that you already have. And there is a lot to flexibility, as you're going to see in the coming presentations, and in particular, if you are signing up for our membership site, which will be available the month of October, you will see that we're really going to take a deep dive into things such as flexibility. Now, let's look in short to what flexibility actually is. So flexibility, like I mentioned very early on, is the motor ability to control our joints. A limb is made up of two joints coming together, and then that joint can move. And it is our muscles that actually, control our joints. The joints themselves, we can't really train or affect directly. We need an external force like a physio to start manipulating our joints. However, though, we can move that joint in space. So if you take your hand, you raise that above your head, now you have moved it from where it was, point A, to where it is right now over your head, which is point B. And for that to happen, you needed to contract your muscles to move that joint or that limb. And this is how we have dynamic or static movements of the joints. So when you contract your muscles and the limb moves as a result of those contractions, it is dynamic. Now, if you take your hand out to the side and you squeeze your muscles, but you push your elbow, imagine pushing your elbow away from you, and then you squeeze your biceps at the same time. So you're squeezing your triceps and your biceps. You can see that your muscles are contracting, but the joint is staying still. And that's what we call static movements. And like you just realized, you can do this yourself. You can control your joints by using the muscles that you have around that joint, which is what we term active movements. And then you also have the ability for someone else or something else to do that while you are relaxing your muscles. So let's say that you're at the physio, or maybe you're with a personal trainer and they help stretch your hip muscles while you relax. They are then passively taking your joints or limbs through their ranges of motion. Ranges of motion just meaning really how far that limb has moved. So here, now we're talking about dynamic and static and active and passive. And these are really important to remember because it creates the four major types of flexibility that we have. And like I said, in future videos, we're going to have a look into, why joint mobility is not what people think it is. And, some people say there that static active or static passive stretching is useless and so on and so forth. It is not. These are just tools in the toolbox, and we have to pick the right one. Now, in fact, for my own personal flexibility training, I use a lot of static active and dynamic active. And we're going to have a look at a few of these. Here you see lots of different photos. You have the swimmer, which presents with a tremendous amount of shoulder flexibility here through the lats and the shoulder joint to reach overhead for a backstroke. That there is of course done by this woman's muscles, so she's doing that movement herself, which means that this is dynamic active. And then you also have the fellas down here, like I mentioned earlier, in a lot of martial arts, you score higher points from kicking to the head, or if there are no points, like Olympic Taekwondo has points. If you are looking at one championship or the UFC, if you kick someone to the head and you knock them out, you win the match, right? So that could be quite, quite useful. So this here again is dynamic active. And then you have the lovely little lady down here, which looks like a personal trainer, maybe a physiotherapist, or maybe a yoga teacher, who is stretching the person's hamstring by moving the heel, towards her face with a straight leg. This means that this lady on the ground has to relax while the person is doing that movement for her. So there is movement going on here, which means that it's very likely that this here is dynamic passive. And then we move to the top photo up here, where this lady here, who's probably a dance teacher or a gymnast teacher of some kind, is stretching the already very flexible hips of this young girl, where you will see that she's pressing down, she's relaxing. So this here is static passive because there is no movement going on here. In contrast to this yoga person, and this could be dancing, martial arts, and all these kinds of things as well, where she would have to have lifted her leg up in this position, and now she's kicking her foot into her hand, and her back muscles are contracting, and so are her leg muscles on the leg that's on the ground. And this here, she's not moving, but it's static active. So she's controlling all the joints herself, but she's not moving. And those are the four major types of flexibility that we actually have. So in short, this is how to think about it. When it's dynamic active, I do the movement as a person. And then dynamic passive, it's kind of like you do it. So you take my limbs, if you're a physio as an example, through their ranges of motion while I relax those muscles. And then in static active, I do the movement again, or I do the contractions rather, but there is no movement across my limbs. And then in static passive, I just relax my muscles in one position and that's it. But there is still no movement. So with that in mind, we have to remember, guys, that flexibility is the motor control to take your joints or limbs through their ranges of motion. Flexibility, therefore, has four major categories or ways of, improving your flexibility. Remember that if flexibility is the motor control or the motor ability, we need to develop that ability, just like you don't know how to do close guard really well in Jiu Jitsu, so you need to practice your close guard. Well, if you don't know how to do flexibility well, you have to practice that ability. And we do that by using the four different types of flexibility training: dynamic active, dynamic passive, static active, and static passive. And they all refer to the movement of the joints and limbs and whether or not my muscles are doing that, or if they're relaxing and another external force might be doing those as well. This is incredibly important to remember, guys, because now when we have a foundation, we can start building on top of this. And one thing that we always hear is that dynamic flexibility, which some people call mobility, which is not correct, is superior to static flexibility. But if you've followed my Instagram stories for a while, I've hampered that this is not necessarily true. And the reason for this is very, 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 very simple. Think about it as a pyramid or a skyscraper. You want that skyscraper to be as tall as physically possible, if that's your goal with a skyscraper. For that to occur, you need a really, really solid foundation. Those pillars for that building go incredible lengths under the ground. They go hundreds of meters into the ground at times with lots and lots of concrete. So you have a nice, strong, stable foundation for that skyscraper to actually go high. Now, use that analogy for flexibility. Those pillars in the ground, however deep they go, that's static flexibility. How tall the skyscraper is above the ground is dynamic flexibility. And as a result of that, the better static flexibility you have, the better dynamic flexibility you have. So if someone tells you that, hey, doing static stretching is not good for you, well, you can argue that, hey, mate, shut up. Because dynamic flexibility is an expression of your static flexibility. So if you're not able to, let's say, lunge very far forwards, or have a really good static hamstring flexibility, you are not going to be able to, as an example, kick very high if you've got really, really poor static flexibility in your hamstrings, because then you're going to have to compensate, which is often going to be your spine, your lower back, and so on and so forth. And this becomes a problem. Now, before we go further and look into the benefits, you can now see that even though some people will tell you that flexibility is just passive and joint mobility is active and all that kind of shit, you can see that even the four main categories of flexibility are either active or passive, depending on what actually happens at the limbs and the joints. And you can develop flexibility through a variety of means, not just what most people see as, I suppose, air quotes, stretching, which would be, bending over, trying to touch your toes. That's an example. A poor example, but it'll hold. And you have to fucking work for it. Some people are blessed with great levels of flexibility. Some people have really good flexibility after they're warmed up for half an hour, but then we would actually determine poor flexibility because it took you a long time to, be able to show those flexibility abilities, and so on and so forth. And what I want you to take away here is that flexibility is something that we always do. If you squat down, it's flexibility. If you try to jump as high as you can, that's partially flexibility. So flexibility is one of those things, guys, that if you don't have it, all human movements will suffer. If you don't have good flexibility in your hips, good luck being really good at Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. If you don't have really flexible shoulders, good luck preventing Kimuras and Americanas, and so on and so forth. You see where this is going. And then we need to make sure that, the practices that we have are specific to Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, which is different to Judo, and so on and so forth. Again, here's just a reminder of everything that we discussed earlier. There is a dynamic active, and there's a dynamic active down here as well. Then we have a dynamic passive, where someone is moving a limb through the ranges of motion for someone. Then we have static passive and static active types of flexibility. And what you will find is that a lot of people, and I don't know why this is. I think I did this myself as well. I was, the meathead. I thought about flexibility as something stupid, that only yoga people did this. And then I tried yoga and I was really shit at it. So I just hated flexibility until I read Stretching Scientifically by Tom Kurtz. And that really changed a lot of things about flexibility for me when I really, truly realized what flexibility is and how I could improve that without having to do yoga. Now, there is nothing wrong with yoga. In fact, I quite enjoy yoga these days, but it's for the mental health component of everything. It's the relaxation that I'm chasing from yoga. I don't use it as a way of, I suppose, practicing my flexibility for things such as grappling sports and splits and that kind of stuff. And another thing that you have to remember is that every single time you load a muscle, a joint, a tendon, all of those things, they experience what we call stress or strain. And we can never ever completely prevent injuries. Cool, that's a lie. One funny example I use with a lot of our students is that, hey, if you fall on your face and you hit your nose on the ground, it's probably going to break. We can't really prevent that from happening. But if you repeatedly get lower back issues doing Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, or your knees are always hurting, or your hips are always feeling tight, and all of those things, it could very likely be that you either have too much or too little flexibility, which negatively affects the relationship between stress and strain in the tissues in the body. So we can mitigate those recurring injuries, which is likely due to things such as fatigue and therefore compensation patterns and everything else. And then we can, I suppose, make it a bit more favorable, that that relationship between stress and strain. And there is also some evidence to suggest that you will receive cardiovascular benefits because it can improve circulation. And I think where most people are looking to flexibility these days is the first and the last points, where we already spoke about injury mitigation, but what about the range of motion? So the range of motion is really just how we measure flexibility. Cool. So if someone is very flexible, they have great range of motion, which means that, let's say that you could lift your heel from the ground all the way up over your head, compared to just from the ground to the front of your hips. In that case, you would have twice as good flexibility, really, because you have a greater range of motion. Now, this could possibly enhance performance, and I think we have suggested this already in the last sort of 20 odd minutes. But one thing here that I want to touch on is that some people say that if you're already very good at grappling sports, but you're not very flexible, and you then improve your flexibility, you have to rethink your strategies in terms of grappling sports. I don't think that's correct. I don't think it's a lie, but I don't think it's correct, because when we look at the definition of flexibility, it is the motor control to take your limbs through those ranges of motion. So if you truly develop flexibility well, specifically for the function that you need, you will see that your movement abilities, thus your grappling sport abilities, will improve as a result of that flexibility training. So I don't think that's correct. And if you look at enhancing performance through, let's say, muscle growth as an example, well, we know that taking your limbs and your joints and your muscles through the biggest range of motion possible will yield more muscle growth. And thus, if that's your performance, then, that would be performance enhancing. And this ties into what the word functional means. And I think we've really debunked all of this already, to be honest, sort of if you read between the lines a bit. But you always hear things such as functional strength, functional this, functional that, F45 as an example, functional 45, But this is a buzzword, because what it really means is that we are trying to improve a basic function for an individual. So what if old Nan, like we said earlier, at 80 years old, just needs to feel a bit better and be able to walk a bit better? What is functional for her is going to be very, very different compared to someone who's training for their side splits. What about, the ability to take someone's back successfully? And all of those things. Other than technical aspects of a grappling sport, what other components would help us with that? Strong glutes, strong abdominal muscles, all of these things would be incredibly important. So the question you have to ask yourself is, what is the function that we are trying to improve here? So don't fall for these, buzzwords that are, functional strength, functional training, so on and so forth. And what I really want you to do here as a part of your toolbox is to critically think. We're looking at a specific outcome. So is that really specific to you or the outcome that you're chasing or where you are at in your training journey? Like we said earlier with, flexibility levels, if you aren't very flexible at the moment, starting with static stretching, static active or static passive for maybe a couple of weeks or 3 or 4 weeks until you then start possessing greater ranges of motion before you transition into very basic dynamic stretching could be quite functional. So we can't just say that static stretching is not functional just because someone claims that dynamic stretching is better. That is not the case. I'm a huge proponent, huge fan of dynamic movement. Let's move as much as we can all the time. That's my philosophy. However, though, if you aren't going to be able to move into the position that we need, then we need to create the ability for that to happen first, which means we need to improve your flexibility, and we can use static active as an example to improve your flexibility because it is one of the types of flexibility that we possess. So here we go, guys. Here's a summary. I know you've been with us now for about half an hour, so thank you for that. If we look at the 4 categories of flexibility, we have I do, you do, with movement, which is dynamic, active, and passive. And then we have I do with no movement. And then I just chill out, which is static passive. And it's very likely that you will see greater results and improvements in your flexibility if you combine one or more of these. And then you will see developing a general level of flexibility for health reasons are going to be very, very important for recovery, for mental health, stress-strain relationship on tissues, and then you need to get more specific towards Brazilian Jiu Jitsu as you go along. And like we've just discussed, flexibility has numerous benefits that a lot of people aren't aware of. So here you see we got a little tool in our toolbox now. We have a hammer, but just because you have a hammer doesn't mean that everything is a nail. Cool. So as we go along in future episodes, we're going to put different kinds of tools in there so that you can really start chipping away at what flexibility is for you. That's it for this time, guys. Thank you for joining us, and we will talk to you very, very shortly.